Welcome to the Alpha Business Podcast. I'm your host.
And I'm your expert analyst.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating place, Nepal. Think about a country that's seen huge changes recently. Ending a long civil war, shifting from a monarchy centuries old to a republic.
And all while being geographically positioned, almost squeezed between India and China, two massive global players.
Exactly. It's this place with layers and layers of history, a vibrant culture, but right now, also just a whole lot of, complex conversations happening inside the country.
Intense debates, really. Different ideas about the past, the future, how to move forward.
Right. What ideas are kind of battling it out, what stories are shaping things there. That's what we want to explore today.
And we're grounding this discussion in a specific piece of analysis.
Yeah, our source is an article from Alpha Business Media titled Contemporary Nepal, an analysis of key narratives and public discourse.
Alpha Business Media, they usually provide pretty sharp analytic strategic insights. This piece is dated June 2, 2025, and it looks specifically at the dominant narratives and public talk that were really shaping things in Nepal through 2024 and into early 2025.
So our mission here is to unpack those narratives. Who's saying what? Who's pushing back? And why does understanding these different viewpoints even matter for getting a handle on Nepal today and maybe where it's going?
And the article sets the stage perfectly, mentioning that backdrop you talked about, the post-conflict transition, the republic being between India and China. That context really is crucial. It shades everything else.
It absolutely does. So where does the article start unpacking these narratives?
It breaks it down quite logically. It looks at political discourse, then economic, then sociocultural. Let's start with politics. The article frames this space as being caught between reconciliation, reform, and instability.
Reconciliation, reform, and instability. That title alone tells you a lot, doesn't it? A nation wrestling with its past, trying to build something stable, but maybe struggling. So what's the first big political narrative?
It tackles the unfinished peace process and transitional justice. This is a hangover from the Civil War, which ended back in 2006. We're talking almost 2 decades later, but the question of how to deal with what happened during the war is still very much alive.
Wow, nearly 20 years. So what's the main view on how to handle that legacy?
Well, the article points to the dominant perspective, often from the government coalitions themselves. And interestingly, these coalitions often include parties that were, enemies during the war, like the Maoist Center and the Nepali Congress. Their line tends to be about reconciliation.
Reconciliation. So focusing on moving forward.
Yeah, mostly through things like truth commissions, reparations for victims. They often point to the recent adoption of a transitional justice law as the key step they've taken. Progress, basically.
Okay, that sounds like one approach, but I'm guessing there's pushback.
Oh, definitely. A very strong counter-narrative. This comes from civil society groups, human rights defenders, and critically from the conflict victims associations themselves. They are really not happy with the recent changes to that transitional justice law.
What's their specific beef with it?
Their core worry, based on the article, is that the amended law has loopholes. Clauses that could effectively give amnesty for really serious human rights abuses committed during the war.
Like what kind of abuses?
Things like torture, enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, stuff like that. They argue that just focusing on truth and handing out some money, without proper prosecution, without accountability for the worst crimes, it's not enough.
They feel it undermines real peace.
Exactly. They argue you can't have sustainable peace without justice. They're demanding accountability, prosecutions, and international human rights bodies tend to back this view.
Man, that's a stark difference. Reconciliation versus accountability. It shows how long that conflict's shadow is. And you see this tension everywhere, don't you? After conflict, how much do you compromise on justice to move on? It makes you think, what's the real cost if justice gets pushed aside?
It's a profound question, yeah. So moving from the past to the present political dynamics, the second narrative is about instability and the demand for reform.
Okay, this sounds familiar territory for a lot of places.
Yeah.
The article mentions Nepal has this history of chronic political instability, right?
Yeah.
Governments changing all the time.
Yeah, frequent shifts in coalitions, governments falling apart. The dominant view, the one you often hear from the leaders of the big established parties, kind of frames this as, unavoidable.
Unavoidable how?
They argue it's just the nature of their fragmented parliament. You have to build consensus, you have to form coalitions, and that means constant negotiation, compromise, which leads to instability. It's presented as like the messy reality of democracy there.
But not everyone buys that explanation. The article talks about a call for new politics.
Absolutely. There's a growing counter-narrative, especially the article notes, uh, among young people and in independent media. They're really critical of the status quo.
Critical in what way? What are they pointing to?
They point directly at things like perceived nepotism, corruption, and what they see as just constant power grabbing and bargaining between the same old political figures. They feel the system is broken, serving elites, not the people.
And this isn't just talk, right? The article mentions actual consequences.
Yeah, it notes the rise of new political forces, independent candidates popping up in recent elections, running specifically on anti-corruption, pro-reform platforms. This whole narrative is feeding demands for things like changing election laws, bringing in fresh blood, a real shakeup.
It really taps into that global frustration, doesn't it? People fed up with established politics, demanding something different. But in Nepal, with its recent history, the stakes feel maybe even higher. What happens if people lose faith entirely in the political class?
It's a serious concern. Okay, third political narrative. Gender equality and inclusion. Nepal's constitution actually looks pretty progressive on paper here, especially with quotas for women.
Right, I remember reading about that, the 33% quota for women in parliament.
Exactly. And the dominant narrative, often from officials and ruling parties, highlights that quota. They present it as solid proof that they're making big strides on gender equality in politics.
So the quota itself is framed as the achievement. But I sense a but coming.
You guessed it. The counter-narrative, pushed by feminist groups and quite a few women politicians, argues, well, it's often just ticking a box. Meaning, women might get the seats because of the quota, but they're still often shut out from real power, from the actual decision-making within the parties or the government. It's formal representation, maybe, but not substantive power.
So the call is for something more than just numbers. The article mentions moving from quantitative to qualitative representation.
Precisely. It's about tackling the deeper issues, the ingrained patriarchal attitudes and structures that still limit women's influence. It's not just about having a seat at the table, but having an equal voice and real influence on what gets decided.
That definitely resonates beyond Nepal. Moving past tokenism to genuine inclusion, dismantling those systemic biases, it shows how putting rights in the Constitution is one thing, but making them a reality on the ground is a whole other challenge.
It really does. Okay, let's shift gears now from politics to the economy. The article titles this section, In Search of a Path from Dependency to Sustainability.
That title flags the central issue right away. How do you build a strong, self-reliant economy when you're starting from a place of, well, relying heavily on others? The first narrative here looks at Nepal being a least developed country and its dependence on aid and remittances.
Right. So the dominant view, common in government and traditional economic thinking, is that foreign aid and investment are, frankly, essential. They're seen as vital for building roads, schools, hospitals, reducing poverty. Can't do it without that external help.
A necessary crutch, basically. But there's a counter view that's critical of that reliance.
Yes, increasingly so. And it targets two main things. First, the huge dependence on money sent home by Nepalists working abroad remittances. The article says it's almost a quarter of the entire GDP.
Wow, a quarter. That's massive.
Huge. And while it's crucial income, the critique is that it signals a massive failure to create enough good jobs inside Nepal. Second, there's criticism of the long-term reliance on foreign aid, which some argue creates a kind of dependency trap and might skew development priorities towards what donors want, not necessarily what Nepal needs most.
So this counter-narrative is pushing for, what, a different economic model?
Essentially, yes, a shift towards building internal strength, focusing on creating jobs at home, developing sustainable agriculture, boosting local industries, trying to become more self-sufficient.
The goal being to break that dependency trap, as they call it, and maybe stop the brain drain, keep young people in the country.
Exactly. It's about building resilience from within. It really makes you think about the true costs of economic dependency, not just financially, but socially, too. It's a dilemma many developing nations face, but Nepal's remittance figures make it incredibly stark.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned Nepal's location earlier. This economic picture must be tied up with geopolitics, too.
Absolutely inseparable. Which leads to the second economic narrative, the geo-economic rivalry, specifically around China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and the U.S.'s Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC.
Ah, yes. The big infrastructure projects from the big powers. This is where being between India and China really comes into play economically.
For sure. The article notes there's a lot of debate, even fighting, within Nepalese political circles about these major projects. Supporters of both BRI and MCC initiatives obviously talk up the economic upsides, better roads, power grids, investment, jobs, opportunity knocking.
But the public conversation isn't just about economics, is it? There's suspicion.
Loads of it, according to the counter-narratives described. There are widespread theories about hidden agendas, about geopolitics driving these projects more than pure development.
Like what specifically?
Well, with China's BRI projects, the big fear you hear is the debt trap narrative. Worry that Nepal could take on massive loans it can't repay, giving China huge leverage.
Okay. And the U.S.'s MCC, what's the suspicion there?
That's often viewed through a different geopolitical lens as part of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. Some see it as an American move aimed at countering China's influence in the region, drawing Nepal into a U.S. sphere.
So Nepal's caught in the middle of this tug-of-war.
Completely. The article says it forces Nepal into this constant, tricky balancing act, trying to get the economic benefits from both sides, from China, from the U.S., maybe India too, without becoming completely dependent or politically beholden to any one of them. It's walking a tightrope.
That really illustrates how global power struggles play out very concretely in smaller countries. It's not abstract. It's about roads, jobs, debt, and ultimately national sovereignty. How do you stay in control when giants are competing around you?
A massive challenge. Okay, finally, the article dives into the sociocultural realm. Identity, religion, equality, the really deep stuff.
And the first narratives sounds potentially explosive. Secularism versus the push to restore Nepal as a Hindu state.
Yeah, this is tied directly to getting rid of the monarchy, which was historically linked to Hinduism, and then declaring Nepal secular in the 2015 constitution. That decision opened up a huge debate about what Nepal is.
So who's on the side of secularism?
The article says supporters include many ethnic minorities, indigenous groups, Janajadis, and secular or left-leaning parties. Their argument is basically that secularism is essential to guarantee religious freedom and equality for everyone in a country that's actually very diverse, religiously and ethnically, not just Hindu.
Makes sense, but there's a strong pushback.
Very strong. From right-wing nationalist groups, pro-monarchy factions, they actively campaign to bring back Nepal's status as a Hindu kingdom.
What's their core argument?
They appeal strongly to the identity of the Hindu majority. They often frame secularism as like an alien concept, something imported, maybe forced on Nepal from outside. And sometimes, the article notes, they link it to concerns about Christian missionaries gaining influence, portraying secularism as a threat to traditional culture.
Wow. That really cuts to the heart of national identity, history, religion. Changing the Constitution isn't just legal. It forces people to ask fundamental questions about who they are as a nation.
Absolutely. And the final narrative here tackles another deep-seated issue, caste and ethnic discrimination.
Even though caste discrimination is outlawed, right?
Exactly. Legally banned, but the article describes it as a persistent, painful reality, especially for Dalits, who were historically at the bottom of the hierarchy.
So what's the official line? The dominant narrative from the state.
Officially, the state condemns discrimination. They point to laws and programs they've set up supposedly to help marginalized groups like Dalits and Janajadis.
But the counter-narrative from those groups says it's not working.
Pretty much. Activists from Dalit and Janajadi communities argue forcefully that the laws are just on paper. Discrimination, they say, is still deeply rooted not just in people's attitudes, but in social customs, and even within the structures of power. It's systemic.
So what are they demanding?
Not just better laws, but real, not declarative, equality and justice. They want a real shift in society, in power dynamics, and also, crucially, genuine respect and recognition for Nepal's cultural and linguistic diversity within the federal system. It hammers home that point. Legal rights don't automatically translate into social reality. It's an ongoing struggle for marginalized communities everywhere to make those rights meaningful, to actually dismantle the structures that hold them back.
So pulling it all together, this Alpha Business Media article paints a picture of Nepal today as, well, complicated.
Definitely. The article concludes that the public discourse is multi-layered and often polarized, which makes sense given these huge transformations the country's going through politically, economically, socially.
And the article's final thought? Does it offer a way forward?
Its closing idea is basically that Nepal's future really hinges on finding ways to manage these competing narratives, to somehow reconcile these different visions, or at least find enough common ground on the big issues to move forward together.
It certainly gives you a framework for understanding the specific pressures and debates inside Nepal. It's not just one story.
Not at all. And it makes you think more broadly, too. This whole idea of competing narratives, dominant views versus counter narratives about politics, the economy, identity.
Yeah.
Well, these battles shape every society, don't they? Maybe the one you live in, the ones you study. They're not just academic points, they're the forces driving change or blocking it.
That's a great point. What does listening closely to a country's internal arguments, its stories and counter stories, tell you about its soul, its challenges, and maybe its potential path ahead? Something to chew on.
Definitely something to think about.
A really insightful look into the narrative shaping Nepal. Thanks for bringing this article to the table for this deep dive.